this is Yashaswini Razdan reporting for EE Times, and I'm sitting here with Mark Surman, who's the president of the Mozilla Foundation.
Great to meet you.
Thanks a lot. What is open source AI? How does it how does AI fit into this world of open source? How does it disturb it? How does it influence it, impact it? Could you just explain that to me?
Well, the way I think about it is we're just in the next era of digital technologies. And so open source through many of the eras, the computer era, the PC era, the web era, the internet era, open source has been a counterforce to centralization, and it's been a force of creativity and spreading opportunity, because basically what does open source mean? It means you can take something and use it for free, you can modify it, you can change it, you can study it, you can share it again, or you can even sell it again. And so I think that has fueled a lot of great software, a lot of what the web is today. And now what is AI? AI is just like the next set of Lego blocks, the next thing we can use to build digital things with, just like the web and computers were. And hopefully, and actually I'm much more optimistic than I was a few years ago, we can have that same open source spirit with how AI comes together. And of course there are a lot of people who are trying to do it differently and centralize it and control it and keep it all for themselves. But we can talk a little bit about that. But I think it's really, we can also talk about the differences. It's just that we want the same kind of things that we had happen, let's say with the web, to happen again in AI, because open source can unlock so much.
So what does meaningful openness mean in the AI context?
So I think you have to break it apart in some different ways. I think for most people, AI is just a chatbot, or AI is just my social media feed, guesses what I want to read. And we have AI all around us. But under the hood, it's actually lots of different components. Like I say, Lego blocks. And if I'm just using that chatbot or the social media feed, somebody, OpenAI, Meta, Alibaba, has snapped them all together in their own way and closed the box, so I can't do anything with them. And in open source, it means having access to all of those Lego blocks, which partly is the models. And if you went back a few years, like before Meta put out Llama, for example, you would think that this era of large language models was going to be without any open source, because it was all so locked up by OpenAI and Anthropic and so on. But we have seen these open weight models come out, so we can maybe talk about what that is, the difference between open source and open weights. But there are lots of freely available models you can build on, whether that's Gemma or GPT-OSS from the big US players, or Quen or Kimi, or all these Chinese ones, as well as Mistral from France, and I think you see more and more will come from other countries. But then that's not all of open source AI. It's not just the models. That's one part of the system. It's also, is there open source data that you can build on? Is there ways that you can orchestrate the compute infrastructure that are open source, and that maybe make compute more equitable through open source? And so we can talk about that a little bit. And then, maybe not the most important, but the one that we work on a lot because people don't pay enough attention to it, is really just the developer tool layer. So when you think about building a website, yes, underneath you have a web server, but you also have, in the old days when somebody like me, you have the database server, you have PHP, you have to have the programming languages. And so a lot of what's missing is the ways to orchestrate and design things from those AI models as open source. But more and more of those are coming. What we're really focused on, or one of the things we're really focused on, is making sure that those are all really easy to use together. If you think about, imagine if you had, you wanted to use all of the different things in the Linux ecosystem, but you didn't have Red Hat, or you didn't have Ubuntu. You just had to figure it out for yourself. I'm going to go over here and download this piece of software and this piece of, it would be incredibly hard. And I think that's the big challenge with the open source AI ecosystem. We have a lot of these pieces coming. There's still some gaps, but they're very hard to use.
Yes, true. let's break it down step by step. Let's first compare open source AI with, the proprietary structure systems. How do they compare with respect to innovation, speed, transparency, local adaptation? How does that happen?
Those are a lot of different things. We could take the whole conversation in all of those. So I think, especially in this summit where there's so much conversation about sovereignty and people taking control of technology in their own countries or in their own lives, a lot of that conversation points to open source because, if I have open source and it means I can use it freely and I can modify it freely, it means that I can really control that. I could put it on my laptop, I could put it on my servers in my country, I could modify it for my use. And so one of the benefits of open source in terms of innovation and taking things forward is I can really take it and make it my own. Whereas on the flip side, the proprietary open source, the proprietary AI options are really all hosted in the cloud, mostly in America. And it means really I'm renting, and I'm renting from somebody else. And if I'm renting from them, I'm always paying them. And sometimes that's fine. You can rent a very nice apartment. But if I'm renting all the stuff I build my whole society or my business on, they can keep putting up the rent, and if they wanted, they could even cut it off, right? And I think in these geopolitical times, sometimes people worry about that. So one of the benefits of open source is just more independence, or more what sometimes people call sovereignty or agency. And then the other really obvious one is that you can adapt it more easily and take it and build your own thing. And so that's another aspect of innovation. If I want to say there's a set of languages that I want to be able to make AI work in, but that aren't there inside of the closed model, I can actually then much more easily fine-tune that and make it my own and make it speak that language. So there's an adaptivity piece of innovation that open source is better at.
Which is very important for India because we've got tons of languages.
Exactly, and it's like 20,000 dialects even. It's not just languages, right? And so AI should be good at helping us speak across languages, helping people who don't read be able to access computers, but that only works if we actually can adapt it to our cultures, and open source is better at that. And then I guess the last piece of it is really that it's something you can kind of pick up and build something new with and kind of run on your own. And that kind of ability to sort of leapfrog, like if maybe I'll put it this way at a very broad level, there's a lot of arguments that get made, and they've been made here at the summit, that if you're a country or even a company that is trying to figure out where to go in AI, you really have to choose. Are we going to go with the big Silicon Valley companies, or are we going to go with China? And those are your only two options. You can't do it on your own. But that's just totally false, because open source is there in AI far enough that you can take up 80% of what you need already and get a head start. And you can get a head start for free. So if you do that and say, where do I want to go next? What's the next 10%, 20% that I want to go? One of the benefits of open source and innovation is it gives you a head start. And you don't have to pick those two options. You can pick your own option, especially if you pick it together with others. Because if this country has this much compute and this country has that much compute, and we say, we need that next 10% to be like this, why not just do it together? It's easy to do it with an open source collaborative model.
We are talking about using open source in digital public infrastructure. So there needs to be a level of transparency. We've already got our payment system, Beam, Aadhaar. It's all based on open source, which other countries are also now asking that whether we can adopt, and India is helping there. So could you just elaborate on that?
Well, I think if you think about auditability and transparency, that's one of the things that open source has historically been very, very good at. You think about how I mean, how much of our lives are digital, but then how much that exposes us to threat, to like cybersecurity threats and so on. And it's one of the reasons that open source infrastructure has become so central to what underpins the internet is the transparency lets people see where's the bug, where's the problem. Yes, bad guys can find bugs, but it means that all of us who are good guys can see them too. And so when a problem comes, many people can go and try to fix it. And so that should be true with open source AI as well, and it is in part. But this is where it's worth making that distinction, and it's a distinction that I think we need to pay attention to and do some work on between what are called open weights AI models and open source, fully open source AI models. And the difference is basically, I mean, I think you know, but for the audience, the real difference is that, you know, as everybody I think knows that by this point, those AI models are made by taking a lot of data and putting them into an AI model. That's called pre-training. And with an open weights model, all of that happens really at once in a black box, and you can't see what happened there. And then you can do post-training fine-tuning, and you can adapt it. And those, you know, those open weights models, the weights are like the things you can configure to make it your own. So that's good in terms of it being free to use and free to adapt. But that one quality of open source, which is the freedom to study it, to understand it, to look inside, to look at the source code, you only get so much of that with an open weights model because you can't see how it was built in the first place. There are people building truly open source models, which means you can see what was all the data that went into it. What are called the pre-training checkpoints. So what happened each time the data was loaded in and refined. And that's something that really I think we should aspire to have truly open source AI models, and they exist. But I would say if the open weights models are 3 months, 6 months behind the mainstream closed models, you know, the truly open models are even further behind. And so they're just not popular yet because we need to get them to a level of performance that is increased. That's something we're committed to, and this is a problem that we need to challenge or to tackle, is making these truly open source models as highly performant as the open weights models. And we'll get there, but it's work and it's investment.
AI deployment is traditionally very compute intensive, very capital heavy. Does bringing openness into the picture influence it in any way?
Well, it is a big difference when we talk about differences between open source software and open source AI, that the cost structure is just very different. The cost structure to create, let's say, an AI model versus to create a piece of open source software, totally different because there's so much compute and energy used. And it does mean that you know, certain things like creating big models, you have to have significant resources, and then also to even host them and use them, you need to pay for compute to do inference, right? To be able to make services with it. But what's starting to happen is various things that kind of are shortcuts, as well as there's real incentives because it's so expensive, for people to innovate in ways that lower the cost and lower the energy use. And so one of the things that you're really going to see in 2026, I think somebody was saying here at the summit yesterday, 2026 will be the year of the small language model, and where people are creating much less compute intensive models for very particular use cases. And those can often leverage the training that has already been done in these base models, which are becoming kind of generic, kind of like commodities. And so I think the small model piece of it will allow, or era of small models will allow innovation, will allow people to do new things at a lower cost. But then you also see people who are really working on technologies to lower the energy use and the compute use and just be more efficient, or technologies to use unused compute cycles through distributed training. And so I think the core headline here is, yes, it's kind of the costs are a barrier to really democratize this technology compared to what they were in computing. And there are things that are really pressures to push those costs down.
How do open AI models compare to the models developed by hyperscaler-backed proprietary systems?
Well, that's an interesting question. And I never say open AI models. I always say open source models because that was the very tricky thing of open AI is they stole the words, even they're not open at all.
They've actually removed non-profit from their financial documents. It was a headline.
Yeah, I know. So that's a whole other topic. But how are open source and hyperscaler models different? Well, some of the hyperscalers produce open source models. NVIDIA produces open source models. Google produces open source models or open weights models. So does actually OpenAI. And so really the difference isn't, they're also then created by independent labs. Mistral specializes in open source models, or some of the Chinese labs do as well. And they're truly open source labs, frontier labs emerging in the US. Like there's one called Reflection, which is really amazing. So I think it's not so much like open source versus hyperscalers versus maybe hyperscalers versus people who kind of have a different vision of how the technology, maybe smaller or maybe more challenging. And I think some of these more challenger companies like Mistral or Reflection are trying to make sure that we democratize the technology for more, trying to make things often for on-device, more affordable uses, trying to push the edge in terms of more openness than just the minimal openness that you get in the open weights models. And so I think that's a big difference. But part of then what's interesting is more what's the same. So what's the same between these is that the kind of basic techniques of transformers and creating large language models, and then as we move into reinforcement learning and then move into agentic frameworks, these are kind of commonly known techniques now. And then the production of these models, as I say, is they're kind of becoming a little bit like commodities. They're not that different than each other. They're a little bit different, but like how different is your coffee and my coffee, which is they're different, but if you really want a cup of coffee, you're going to drink either coffee. And so there's actually, the good thing is that the open source models and the proprietary models are increasingly the same. They increasingly give you the thing you want from those models, but with the open source ones, you're not paying those big rents. You have the flexibility to do with what you want. You have the flexibility to get a head start and build something else. So really the differences are those freedoms that come with open source as opposed to differences in like what the model is. Kind of they're the same thing.
But with having a certain degree of freedom, it also increases the risk of misuse. And considering when we talk about open source systems, we say that there is a large community there to audit, edit. But when we are not, even in proprietary AI models, we are not able to track, where information can come from, what information is correct, what information is not correct. So does that, translate to AI when it's open source AI? Because now there is a larger pool of contributors, larger influx of information, and it is completely unregulated because so many contributions.
Well, I think we know in the economy that we live in, all of those hyperscalers and those closed models are also completely unregulated. So I think the difference is, who do you trust? Do you trust one of these big companies, or do you trust a community that has an interest in this stuff being secure? So that's one thing, and we know from the last 20 years of cybersecurity, as a technical community, we're very good when there's something really risky that happens to respond to it. So I think it's where you put your trust is the first thing I would say. And then, there was some interesting research, I think it's now probably 18 months or even 2 years old, where the Department of Commerce in the US did a big study. It was commissioned by the White House to look at, is there different risk that is coming from open weight models than closed models? Are they more open to misuse than each other? And what they found is basically the language they use is there's no marginal risk. There's no real margin of it being easier to abuse. You can jailbreak a closed model. You can jailbreak an open model, and they're there to be used for creative purposes. But anything that can be used for creative purposes can usually be used creatively to harm people too. And so there's not a dramatic difference there. And I think the difference is that history of a community solving a problem with risks as opposed to a company being the sole actor responsible for risks. Now that said, I think you're also touching on something different, which is not, can this model be dangerous or that model or this paradigm be dangerous or that paradigm be dangerous, is can AI create misinformation or can it create deepfakes and these things, to some degree, the centralized ones we trust them, or even there can be a little bit of social pressure or regulation to make it harder to create abusive content on those centralized systems. But we've seen with XAI that's just up to the company, right? And it's not a problem of open source or not.
Yes.
It's really about who is it that is deploying it. So you can be deploying open source responsibly, you can be deploying closed AI responsibly, and that'll be the thing that determines, are people creating abusive content. People are always going to find a way to do that, though.
Yes.
The last thing I'll say is, like, we just need to use AI to detect and get rid of that abusive content. So one of the things, I'm on the board of directors of a thing called Roost, which is a very funny name for an organization, and it's called Robust Online Safety Tooling.
Okay.
And what it is, it's an open source foundation focused on building AI-driven trust and safety software for any platform. And so platforms like Discord or Blue Sky have contributed their software so that others in the industry can use it to, find, abusive material, report it, take it down automatically. And I think that's a really key thing, is for us to make sure that the safety tooling that we have is also open source, so as many companies, as many governments as possible can deploy AI in a way that helps us find false and abusive information and alert people to it or eliminate it.
What kind of business models exist with, open source AI coming into the picture?
It's funny, even after 20 years, and most people don't know of the details of open source, but 20, 30 years of open source, even technical people, government people who are working on tech come to me all the time and say, well, that's just philanthropy, that open source stuff. I don't know. And it's like, my gosh, you're crazy. The whole tech industry runs on top of open source. Like, not everything is open source, but all of these big cloud providers, AWS, Azure, GCP, all of them, Facebook, Twitter, all of the things, they're built on top of Linux. They're built on top of open source software. And under that, people are making money. And people like Red Hat are making money, or people like different database providers are making money, because you still need to, of course, pay people, but you still need to also get help in delivering these things. And so there's some basic business models. One is certainly charging for your services. One is charging for support. And then the other is just actually pooling your money. So a lot of it is, if we're all relying on the same software, we all contribute some money, or our engineers. And people worry about this kind of free rider problem, that some people will contribute and others won't. And sometimes that's a problem, but by and large, because open source lets you contribute, which means you add your own code to say you want this feature, you want it to do this thing, people are actually quite incented to contribute because they want to be able to shape the direction of the things they're using. And so there are lots of ways to make money. But I think maybe two business stories that are worth highlighting at the macro level. So at the micro level, everybody's got to have a business model around their open source in some way to fund it. At the macro level, that way of doing business represents huge leverage for the economy. So the chief economist, Frank Nagel of the Linux Foundation, he wrote this study, or did all of this research that said, you look at the last era of open source, and over the last 20 years, how much was the value of that? The supply side value, which is basically how much did it cost to create it, like people's labor and the money spent, and it's basically $4 billion. Sounds like a big number. It's a small number when you compare to these big AI companies. But what was the demand side value? So how much value did it create for people who would have otherwise had to buy that software? And so how much value did it create for businesses and for governments? $8 trillion. 4 billion, 8 trillion in terms of the amount of economic leverage that open source business model creates. So think about that savings. People would have had to spend, almost $8 trillion more to get what we have today in our digital economy if we hadn't had open source. And then he's started to do some looking at open source AI, and he looks that the capabilities are relatively close for most use cases between open weight models and proprietary models, and it costs you about 20%. So you are paying 80% more just to have the privilege of using a closed model.
Oh.
And I think that's going to change. There was a blog post published by, I think, the CTO of Pinterest in December, and they said, we've saved tens of millions of dollars just by switching over to these open weights models. So I think 2026 will also be a year where a lot of energy and money moves to open source AI.
And is there a potential to do something different?
I think absolutely. I mean, I'm Canadian, and you heard, many people will have heard the Mark Carney speech from Davos where he talked about the middle powers, needing to create an alternative as the order of the world kind of reorganizes. And that doesn't mean, being a club against anybody. I think we will always be friends with and trade with the US and Canada, and I think many countries will, and work with China on many things. But we need an approach to the global economy where everyone can participate and everyone can benefit. And that's the same with AI. And I think as that conversation happens economically and politically, it actually creates a space for a different AI model where it's not that we won't use Google or use Alibaba. Different people will choose those for different things. But it does create openness, I think, for competitors and for different competitive approaches like open source AI. And so I think we're in a really interesting time where there's a big opportunity. People want some things that are different.
But with open source AI coming into the picture, how do the existing licensing regulations, do we need to bring in new licensing regulations?
I think different people have different opinions. I would say from Mozilla's perspective, you always want to still use what we talk about as a permissive license, MIT license, an Apache license, a Mozilla license, which means there's very little restrictions on it. There are people with AI who will argue that you want to try to embed responsible AI principles inside of a license or things like that. I think it's very difficult. An open source license, to get very nerdy about it, is basically a hack on copyright law. And it uses a contract, it uses a license to say, I am giving you special rights to this thing I created. And that hack on copyright law, where we grant anyone who wants them the rights to modify the thing that we created, has created this whole big open ecosystem and this whole world of creativity and innovation. I think those licenses are still the right tool. That hack on copyright is still the right tool. We've metabolized it as a society and an industry. How we get to some of the other goals that people have, like the responsible use of AI, I think we need that, but we need to find other ways to do it. We need to do it through building guardrail technology, building business processes, building national laws. But I don't think changing open source licenses is the path to that.
5 years from now, what would be the signal that open source AI has actually succeeded? You've been in the industry.
Well, I think if everybody's using it, but I think 5 years from now it will succeed in what dimensions. And I think some dimensions to watch for are: does the technology that, if you're a developer or you're an enterprise or you're a government that you're building on, come from many places, right? Or speak in many languages? Because I think open source is going to really, if open source AI is successful, it means that many more people can participate in creating this next era of society and our economy and our technology. So I think maybe the thing to watch for 5 years from now is much more diversity of where this comes from, and more of us are creators and not just consumers of the technology.
Well, thanks a lot.